in July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg in the region of Alsace, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped into the street and began to dance. She danced without music. She danced without explanation. She danced in silence, or in whatever silence existed in a medieval city in summer. The sounds of the street, the distant cathedral bells, the noise of the market quarter. She danced for hours. She did not appear able to stop. By the following morning, she was still dancing. By the end of the first week, her feet were bleeding. Her legs were failing, and she had not stopped. She would dance for approximately 6 days before she was taken away, exhausted, to a shrine outside the city. By the time she was removed, others had joined her. Not one or two, dozens, within a month, somewhere between 50 and 400 people. The contemporary accounts vary, and the truth of the number is uncertain, were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg in the same uncontrollable fashion, unable to stop, their bodies moving without apparent will or purpose, in the heat of the Alsatian summer, until some of them fell and did not rise. The dancing plague of 1518 lasted from July to September. It has not been fully explained in the Strasbourg in 1518 was a prosperous city by the standards of its time, a significant trading centre on the Rhine, with a population of perhaps 20,000 people, a cathedral whose spire was the tallest structure in the world for over 2 centuries, and a guild structure that organized the economic and social life of its inhabitants with the careful rigidity of the late medieval period. It was also, in 1518, a city under considerable stress. The years immediately preceding the summer of 1518 had been marked by famine. Poor harvests across Alsace had driven food prices beyond the reach of the poor, and the city's records show a population that was hungry, exhausted, and frightened. Disease was persistent in the urban environment of the period, with the standard inventory of plague, sweating sickness, and the various fevers that moved through densely populated medieval cities with reliable regularity. The political situation was unstable. The Reformation, which would transform Europe, was barely a year away from Luther's 95 Theses. The social fabric of Strasbourg in July 1518 was a fabric under strain, the kind of strain that certain researchers have argued is a precondition for the particular phenomenon that began when Frau Troffea stepped. Almost nothing is known about Frau Troffea as an individual. She appears in the historical record only as the initiating case of the dancing plague, the first person identified as dancing, the one from whom the event is conventionally dated. Her first name is not consistently recorded. Her age, occupation, and circumstances are not documented in the surviving sources. She was presumably a resident of Strasbourg, a woman of the city rather than a traveller passing through, though even this is not certain. What the sources agree on is the duration and character of what she did. She danced continuously, or nearly continuously, for approximately 6 days, in a manner that observers described as involuntary, as though she had no control over her body's movement. She was taken, at some point in the first week, to the shrine of Saint Vitus at Saverne, outside the city. Saint Vitus was the patron saint of dancers and of the condition known as Saint Vitus's dance, a real neurological disorder characterized by involuntary movement that may be relevant to understanding what happened in Strasbourg. Whether Frau Troffea was cured at the shrine, whether she recovered from exhaustion, whether she survived the episode at all, these things are not recorded. She entered the historical record with a dance she could not stop, and she left it The speed at which the dancing spread from Frau Troffea to others has been noted by every researcher who has examined the case. Within days of her first appearance in the street, others had begun to dance beside her. The contagion, if that is the right word, and it is a word that requires qualification in this context, moved through the population of Strasbourg in a pattern that resembled the spread of an infectious disease, but was not, by any currently accepted mechanism, a biological infection. People who saw the dancers began to dance. People who came to watch became participants. The dancing moved through the streets and into the squares and through the quarters of the city in a wave that gathered mass as it moved. Each new dancer adding to the spectacle that drew further observers who became further dancers. By the end of July, the city council was confronted with a phenomenon that had grown beyond anything they could easily categorize. The source is inconsistent about numbers. Some contemporary accounts suggest 50 dancers. Others suggest several hundred. The truth is likely somewhere in the range that makes both figures possible. A public event large enough to require an official response, but not so large as to be literally hundreds of people. Whatever the number, it was enough to force the city. The response of the Strasbourg City Council to the dancing plague is one of the most studied aspects of the case, because it is one of the most counterintuitive. When confronted with dozens of people dancing uncontrollably in the streets, the council's initial response was not to attempt to stop the dancing. Their response was to encourage it. They consulted physicians, who advised that the affliction was a natural illness, a disease of the blood, perhaps, or the result of overheated spirits in the body, and that the cure was more dancing. If the affliction was a hot disease, the body needed to work through it, and working through it meant dancing until it passed. Acting on this medical advice, the council cleared the guild hall and set up a stage. They hired professional musicians, fiddlers and pipers, to provide accompaniment for the dancers, on the theory that structured, rhythmic music would help the afflicted bodies complete their dance and recover. They hired strong men to support the dancers and prevent them from falling and injuring themselves. They organized, in effect, a civic program of therapeutic dancing, managing an outbreak of involuntary movement with the medical technology available to a 16th century European city. It did not work. The guild hall where the city council assembled the dancers in the summer of 1518 stood on the Kornmarkt, the grain market square of Strasbourg, one of the central civic spaces of the medieval city. The building is gone now. The square has been rebuilt and reshaped over the centuries, and the specific hall where the dancing took place no longer exists in its 1518 form. But in that summer, it would have been a large, timber-framed structure with a substantial interior space capable of holding many people. The decision to concentrate the dancers in the guild hall had a practical logic. It removed them from the streets, which were disrupted by the spectacle. It kept them together, where they could be monitored and managed, and it provided the regulated environment in which the medical prescription of structured dancing could be implemented. The musicians played, the dancers danced. In the accounts of observers, the scene was described in terms that suggest both a kind of compelled performance and a kind of suffering, people moving without will, supported by hired men to prevent collapse, accompanied by music that did not stop, in a hall that became, over the weeks of July, something between a hot. The decision to hire musicians for the dancing plague is the decision that subsequent historians have most often cited as a catastrophic error of judgment by the Strasbourg Council. The logic was sound by the medical standards of the time. dancing with music is more controlled than dancing without it, and the prescribed cure was dance, so music was appropriate accompaniment. But what the council did not anticipate, could not have anticipated, given the conceptual framework available to them, was that the presence of professional musicians and a formal performance environment may have encouraged more people to join. The spectacle of organized, accompanied dancing in the Guildhall was a public event, visible and audible from the surrounding streets, and the combination of spectacle and the apparent social sanction of city council approval may have been exactly the kind of social signal that accelerates mass psychogenic illness. The music played and more people danced. The musicians were eventually dismissed. The council reversed its policy after the situation continued to deteriorate, but by then the pattern was established, and the dancing in the streets continued with or without official accompaniment. The sound of the fiddlers on the Kornmarkt in the summer of 1518 is one of the strangest sounds in the history of European cities. Professional music hired to cure a disease. The people who danced in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 were, according to the contemporary sources, overwhelmingly poor. This is not surprising. The poor quarters of the city were the quarters where famine and disease had hit hardest, where the stress and anxiety of the preceding years had accumulated most completely. The accounts describe people who danced until their shoes wore through, whose feet bled on the cobblestones, who collapsed and were carried aside and recovered and began to dance again. They were described by observers as suffering, their faces showing distress, not pleasure, their bodies moving without apparent volition, without the signs of enjoyment that characterize ordinary dancing. Some accounts mention foam at the mouth, convulsive movements, cries and groans. Some accounts describe visions, the dancers speaking of what they saw, of figures and presences that were not visible to observers. The dancing was not, by any account that has survived, anything resembling voluntary celebration. It was experienced by those who went through it and by those who watched as an affliction, something happening to the dancers rather than something they were doing. This distinction is important for understanding both the historical response to the event and the modern. The Cathedral of Notre Dame de Strasbourg stands at the centre of the medieval city, its single spire completed in 1439 at a height of 142 metres, which made it the tallest human-made structure in the world for over 200 years. In July of 1518, it had been standing for less than a century in its completed form, and it dominated the city in both a physical and spiritual sense. The largest building visible from any point in Strasbourg, the centre of the religious life that organised the days and weeks and years of the population, the institution whose calendar marked the time and whose bells measured the hours. The dancers moved through the streets of a city that was organised around this building, under its shadow at certain hours of the day, in earshot of its bells always. The religious context of the dancing plague is significant. The late medieval period in Alsace was one of intense religious anxiety, with the standard dread of divine punishment, purgatory, and the complex supernatural geography of the Catholic cosmos pressing on the daily lives of people who already had famine and disease to contend with. The cathedral watched over the summer of 1518 as it watched over every summer, and whatever its clergy made of the dancing in the streets below. Saint Vitus is a 3rd century Christian martyr whose cult became particularly important in medieval Germany and the surrounding regions. He is the patron of dancers, of actors, of comedians, and also, crucially, of those afflicted with the neurological condition that bears his name. Saint Vitus's dance, or career, characterized by rapid, uncoordinated involuntary movements of the face, hands, and feet The connection between the saint and involuntary movement appears to have been established early in the cult's development, and by the late medieval period the shrines of Saint Vitus had become destinations for those suffering from movement disorders, epilepsy, and related conditions. The shrine at Saverne, outside Strasbourg, to which Frau Troffea was taken in the first week of the dancing, was one of these destinations. The practice of dancing at the shrine, circling it, performing ritual movements in honor of the saint, was apparently therapeutic in some cases, and the pilgrimage to the shrine was a standard response to cases of uncontrolled dancing in the region. This background is important for understanding both the city council's initial response and the broader context of the 1518 event. The dancing plague did not appear in a cultural vacuum. The region had a history of dancing episodes, a saint associated with dancing illness, and a set of established responses. 1518 was larger and more severe than previous episodes, but it was not the most widely cited scientific explanation for the dancing plague of 1518 is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that infects rye and other cereals under certain conditions of moisture and temperature, producing alkaloids that, when consumed in sufficient quantities, cause a condition called ergotism. Ergotism has two main forms: gangrenous ergotism, which causes constriction of the blood vessels and eventually gangrene of the extremities, and convulsive ergotism, which causes seizures, hallucinations, and involuntary muscle contractions. The convulsive form is the one most often invoked in discussions of the dancing plague, since its symptoms, uncontrolled movement, hallucinations, a sense of external compulsion, are broadly consistent with the accounts of the 1518 dancers. The conditions of 1518 were consistent with ergot contamination. The wet summers that followed failed harvests created exactly the conditions under which ergot thrives on stored grain, and the poor of Strasbourg were eating whatever bread they could afford, which was more likely to be contaminated than the bread consumed by the wealthy. The ergot theory has been criticized on several grounds, the most significant being that ergotism does not typically produce sustained, directed movement. It produces convulsions and seizures, not dancing. The 1518 accounts describe something more organized, more specifically dance-like. The explanation favored by most contemporary researchers who have studied the dancing plague seriously is mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon in which physical symptoms spread through a population by social transmission rather than biological contagion. Mass psychogenic illness is not a modern category imposed on historical events. The phenomenon has been documented throughout recorded history and continues to occur in the present day. It is typically triggered by a population under severe psychological stress, often involving a specific symbolic framework, a belief in demonic possession, in divine punishment, in a specific illness or curse that gives the symptoms their particular character. The symptoms are real. People who experience mass psychogenic illness are genuinely suffering, genuinely unable to control their bodies, genuinely experiencing the symptoms they report. The mechanism is psychological and social, not biological, but this does not make the suffering less real or the phenomenon less significant. In the Strasbourg case, the stress triggers are well documented: famine, disease, social disruption, religious anxiety. The symbolic framework is also documented: the cult of Saint Vitus, the regional tradition of dancing illness, the specific fears and beliefs of late medieval Catholic culture in Alsace. The mass psychogenic illness model fits the evidence well. It does not explain everything, it is the best current explanation for an event that remains 500 years later. The religious life of Strasbourg in 1518 was conducted under the theology of late medieval Catholicism, which held that the world was a battleground between divine and demonic forces, that illness could be punishment for sin, that saints could intercede on behalf of the afflicted, and that certain places and objects had specific spiritual powers over specific conditions. Into this framework, the dancing plague arrived as something that needed to be classified. Was it a natural illness, as the physicians suggested, or a supernatural affliction, as the clergy might argue? The city council's decision to consult physicians first, and to adopt a medical rather than a religious response, is itself historically interesting. It reflects the growing authority of learned medicine in urban governance in the early 16th century. But the religious response ran parallel to the official one. The dancers were also sent to shrines, also subjected to exorcism in some accounts, also prayed over by clergy who understood what was happening in terms very different from those of the physicians. The tension between the medical and religious interpretations of the dancing plague is one of the most revealing aspects of the case, because it shows the event arriving at precisely the moment when the established frameworks for understanding suffering were in competition with each other, and neither was adequate to the July and August in Strasbourg are hot months. The city sits in the Rhine Valley, sheltered from the Atlantic weather systems that moderate the climate of Northern Europe, and the summers in the region can be genuinely severe by the standards of Northern France and Germany. In 1518, the summer appears to have been particularly hot. The crop failures that had produced the famine in the preceding years were partly the result of weather patterns that disrupted the agricultural calendar, and the summer of 1518 continued this pattern. The dancers in the streets of Strasbourg were dancing in heat, on cobblestones that retained warmth through the night, in the heavy clothing of the period, in a city where the smell and press of 20,000 people and their animals would have been constant and substantial. The physical conditions of the dancing are part of its character. People who dance in summer heat until their shoes wear through and their feet bleed are people in extreme physical distress, regardless of the psychological mechanism that initiated and sustained the movement. The heat is also relevant to the ergot theory, which proposes that the alkaloids in contaminated grain would have been particularly toxic in a hot, dehydrated body. Whatever was happening in Strasbourg that summer, it was happening in conditions that would have made any The physicians of Strasbourg in 1518 practiced a medicine that was still fundamentally Galenic, based on the framework of the four humours established in antiquity and transmitted through Arabic scholarship into medieval European universities. In this framework, disease was an imbalance of the four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with particular qualities and particular symptoms. The physicians who examined the dancers and advised the city council concluded that the dancing was caused by an excess of hot blood, a condition in which the sanguine humour was overabundant and overheated, producing involuntary movement as the body attempted to expel or balance the excess. The prescribed treatment, more dancing, in a structured setting, was consistent with this diagnosis. The body needed to work off the excess, and denying it the movement would cause the heat and excess to build further. This advice was wrong, in the sense that the dancing did not cure the affliction, but it was wrong in a scientifically respectable way. The physicians applied the best framework available to them to a phenomenon they had never seen at this scale, and they produced a treatment recommendation that was internally consistent with their theory. The recommendation failed, but the reasoning was not irrational. The dancing plague of 1518 lasted approximately 2 months, from the initial appearance of Frau Troffea in July to the end of September, when the last accounts of mass dancing in Strasbourg cease. 2 months is a long time for a civic emergency. The City Council's management of the event moved through several phases. The initial encouragement of dancing in the Guildhall, which was abandoned when it failed, a reversal to discouragement and dispersal, with the musicians dismissed and the formal stage removed, and eventually a renewed policy of sending the afflicted to the shrine of St. Vitus, both the one at Saverne and others in the region. The question of what ended the dancing plague is as unresolved as the question of what caused it. Contemporary accounts suggest a combination of factors: the pilgrimages to the shrines, which may have provided both a physical removal from the social environment of the dancing and the symbolic framework for recovery; the exhaustion of the dancers themselves, whose bodies could not sustain the movement indefinitely; and possibly changes in the environmental conditions that had contributed to the outbreak. What is clear is that by October 1518, the dancing had stopped. The city returned to its ordinary life. The episode entered the chronicle records, was noted by physicians and clergymen, and was gradually absorbed into the category of things that had happened, and contemporary accounts of the dancing plague record deaths among the dancers. The numbers are uncertain. As with all the numbers in this case, the sources disagree, and the truth is inaccessible. But the general claim that some dancers died as a direct result of the dancing is consistent across multiple independent sources. The causes of death recorded are exhaustion, heart failure, and stroke, all of which are plausible consequences of sustained, involuntary, intense physical exertion over days and weeks. A person who cannot stop dancing for 6 days, who dances through the night as well as the day, who's fed and watered by attendants but cannot rest, is a person whose cardiovascular system is under extraordinary and potentially fatal stress. The deaths are also significant for what they reveal about the severity and involuntary nature of the dancing. People do not dance to death voluntarily. Whatever was compelling the dancers of 1518 to move, it was compelling them with a force sufficient to override the body's normal protective mechanisms, the pain of bleeding feet, the exhaustion that should trigger collapse, the basic survival instinct that causes a person to stop doing something that is killing them. The deaths are the most extreme evidence of the compulsive character of the dancing, and they are part of why the event has remained. The food situation in Strasbourg in the years leading up to 1518 is documented in the city's administrative records. The harvests of the preceding years had been poor, the result of a combination of cold springs, late frosts, summer drought in some years and excessive rain in others, and the general agricultural instability that characterized the early 16th century in northern Europe. The granaries that should have provided the city through the lean months had been drawn down further than usual, and the price of bread, the basic caloric foundation of life for the urban poor, had risen to levels that made it genuinely difficult for the lowest income households to eat adequately. The rye bread that sustained the poor of Strasbourg was also the food most susceptible to ergot contamination. The connection between the depleted grain stores, the contaminated bread, and the dancing plague is the foundation of the ergot theory. But the grain also matters as social context, independent of any pharmacological effect. A population that is hungry, that has been hungry for years, that sees no immediate prospect of relief, is a population with a kind of chronic, grinding stress that researchers in mass psychogenic illness identify as a precondition for The dancing plague of 1518 is sometimes compared to another medieval European phenomenon, tarantism, the condition attributed in southern Italy to the bite of the tarantula spider, in which the victim was compelled to dance until the poison was expelled from the body. The comparison is instructive both for what the two phenomena share and for how they differ. Both involve compulsive, uncontrolled dancing that is understood as illness rather than celebration. Both were treated by the prescription of more dancing, often with specific music believed to have curative properties. Both occurred in populations under stress, in regions with specific cultural frameworks that gave the symptoms their character. The differences are also significant. Tarantism was attributed to a specific physical cause, the spider bite, and was organized around a specific musical tradition, the tarantella, that developed as the prescribed treatment. The Strasbourg dancing had no such clear causal attribution, and no organized musical tradition associated with its cure. Researchers who study mass psychogenic illness see both phenomena as examples of the same general mechanism: socially transmitted symptom expression in populations with shared stress and shared symbolic frameworks, operating in different cultural environments that gave the symptoms different specific characters. The spider bite and the saint's curse are different explanations for what may be the same. The dancing plague of 1518 is known to us through a handful of contemporary and near-contemporary sources. City council minutes, which are the most administratively reliable, are chronicled by a local historian named Sebastian Brandt, who is better known as the author of The Ship of Fools, but who also documented local events, physician accounts that circulated in medical literature, and some religious chronicles. These sources agree on the basic facts. The dancing started with one woman, spread to many, was managed by the city council, and lasted several weeks, but disagree on almost everything else: numbers, duration, the character of the symptoms, the outcome. This is normal for pre-modern event documentation. Eyewitnesses saw different things, understood what they saw through different frameworks, and recorded what was significant to them in their particular role as administrator, physician, or religious observer. The city council minutes are the driest and most reliable. They record the decision to hire musicians, the decision to dismiss them, the referral of dancers to shrines. They do not speculate about causes. The physician accounts speculate more freely. The religious chronicles see in the dancing the fingerprints of either divine punishment or demonic activity. Together, they give a fragmentary but surprisingly rich picture of an event that nobody fully understood. The Kornmarkt, the grain market square of Strasbourg, was the centre of the dancing plague at its height. It was here that the Guildhall stood, here that the stage was erected, here that the professional musicians played their fiddled accompaniment to the involuntary performances of the afflicted. The Kornmarkt was one of the main commercial squares of medieval Strasbourg, a place of regular market activity, of the daily buying and selling that sustained the city's population. In July 1518, it was also a place of extraordinary and troubling spectacle. Dozens of people dancing without stopping, the music of hired fiddlers carrying across the stone square, the hired men supporting collapsing dancers, the crowd of observers that grew and shrank and grew again as the city's population came to witness something none of them had seen before. The square itself has been substantially rebuilt over the centuries. The Guildhall is gone. The specific stones on which the dancers' bleeding feet moved are under later construction. But the square still exists, still bears the name that connects it to the grain trade that was itself connected to the conditions that may have produced the plague. Standing in it now, in the ordinary movement of a contemporary Alsatian city, it is difficult to reconstruct the scene of July 1518. The city has moved on. The medical community of Strasbourg in 1518 included several practitioners of what was, by the standards of the period, sophisticated learned medicine. The city was prosperous enough to support professional physicians, university-trained men who had studied Galen and Avicenna, and who understood illness within the humoral framework transmitted from antiquity. Their consultation by the city council reflects the growing importance of medical authority in civic governance in the early 16th century, a development that was itself part of the broader intellectual transformation of the Renaissance. The physicians did not diagnose the dancing plague as supernatural, which is significant. In an era when demonic possession and divine punishment were available explanatory frameworks, the Strasbourg physicians chose a natural, physiological explanation: hot blood, overheated spirits, a disease of the body rather than the soul. This choice did not produce an effective treatment, but it placed the dancing plague within the emerging tradition of naturalistic medicine that would eventually produce the modern understanding of mass psychogenic illness 5 centuries later. The physicians who advised the city council in July 1518 were wrong in their specifics and right in their general orientation. What was happening to the dancers of Strasbourg was a physical phenomenon, not a supernatural one, and it deserved. The people who watched the dancing in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 were themselves participants in the event, in the sense that the dancing spread partly through observation. The social dynamics of the spectacle, the gathering crowd, the visible suffering of the dancers, the extraordinary and disorienting character of what was happening, were part of the mechanism by which the phenomenon propagated. Contemporary accounts describe people coming to watch, being drawn into the dancing themselves, unable to explain afterward why they had joined. In the framework of mass psychogenic illness, this pattern is characteristic. The observation of symptoms in a distressed population under conditions of shared stress and shared symbolic understanding can trigger the same symptoms in the observer. The crowd around the Kornmarkt stage was both audience and potential participants, separated from the stage by a distinction that could dissolve without warning. The city council's decision to concentrate the dancing in the guild hall, which was intended to contain and manage it, may have inadvertently created the ideal conditions for social contagion, a public spectacle in a central location, with official sanction, accessible to the entire population of the city. The management strategy and the propagation mechanism were, by an unfortunate coincidence, among the accounts of the dancing plague are references to children joining the dancers in the streets of Strasbourg. Children are particularly susceptible to mass psychogenic illness in modern documented cases. They are more suggestible than adults, more responsive to social cues, and less likely to have the kind of conscious resistance that might prevent an adult from joining a visible outbreak. The reports of children dancing in 1518 are fragmentary and not easily separable from the general accounts of the outbreak, but their presence is noted in some sources and is consistent with what modern research on mass psychogenic illness would predict. The image of children dancing in the summer streets of a medieval city is one of the most affecting aspects of the 1518 accounts. The involuntary movement affecting the most vulnerable, the smallest bodies of the city's poor caught in the same compulsion that afflicted their parents and neighbours. The city council's management programme, with its professional musicians and its guild hall stage, was presumably not designed with children in mind. Whether children were sent to the saint fighters' shrines along with adult dancers, whether they were kept at home by parents, whether they recovered more quickly or more slowly, these things are not recorded. The children are in the record only as a detail. The dancing plague ended in September of 1518. The ending was not sudden or dramatic. As far as the contemporary sources record, it was a gradual diminution, the numbers declining over the course of the month until by October there were no reports of mass dancing in Strasbourg. What produced the ending is as unclear as what produced the beginning. Several factors have been proposed. The pilgrimages to the Saint Vitus shrines may have been effective, not because the shrines had miraculous curative properties, but because the pilgrimage removed afflicted individuals from the social environment of the city, which was the environment in which the contagion spread. A change in the social dynamics of the outbreak, a tipping point at which the dancing became less contagious, the shared stress less acute, the symbolic framework less compelling, may have been the mechanism. The onset of cooler autumn weather, which would have reduced the physical toll of dancing and potentially reduced ergot contamination if that was a contributing factor, may have helped. The end of the dancing plague is as mysterious as its beginning. It stopped, as it started, without a clear and sufficient explanation, and the city of Strasbourg returned to its ordinary life, carrying the memory of 2 months of extraordinary suffering in its. The Rhine runs past Strasbourg on its eastern edge, marking the boundary between Alsace and the region that is now Baden-Württemberg in Germany. In 1518, the Rhine was the great commercial artery of northern Europe, the highway by which goods moved between Italy and the North Sea, by which news and plague and religious controversy travelled from city to city. The river would have been visible from parts of the city, its sound and smell present in the life of residents near the eastern quarter. It provided the water that the city needed, for drinking, for dyeing, for tanning, for all the industries that made Strasbourg a trading centre. And it also provided the flooding that periodically disrupted those industries and the agriculture around the city. The Rhine in summer 1518 was carrying, as it always carried, the traffic of commerce and communication that connected Strasbourg to the larger world of the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. News of the dancing plague would have left the city along the Rhine, carried by merchants and travellers who had seen it, and arrived at other cities weeks later as a report of something strange that had happened in Alsace. The Rhine has been the same river for 500 years. It still runs past Strasbourg. It does not record what the dancing plague of 1518 was not the first episode of mass dancing in the historical record of medieval Europe, and it was not the last. Researchers have identified a series of episodes dating back to the 12th and 13th centuries in Germany, the Low Countries, and France. People dancing in streets and churchyards, unable to stop, often in groups, often following patterns of stress and disruption similar to those that preceded the 1518 event. The most famous earlier episode is the dancing at Aachen in 1374, in which large numbers of people were reported dancing through the streets of the city and the surrounding region in a manner similar to what would occur in Strasbourg over a century later. These earlier episodes established the cultural framework, the connection to Saint Vitus, the prescribed pilgrimage to shrines, the practice of treating dancing illness with more dancing, that the Strasbourg authorities drew on when the 1518 outbreak began. The 1518 event is the best documented because Strasbourg had better administrative records than most medieval cities, but it was part of a pattern. The pattern ended in the late 16th century, roughly coinciding with the Reformation and the shift in religious and cultural frameworks that came with it. Whether the end of the pattern was caused by the change in frameworks, or by changes in the underlying stress conditions, or by something else, dance is not a neutral activity in the cultural context of 15th and 16th century Alsace. It was associated with both the sacred and the profane, with religious celebration and with carnivalesque disorder, with the ritual movements prescribed by the church and with the secular pleasures condemned by it. The moral status of dancing was contested in the late medieval period. Certain dances were approved, certain ones were prohibited, and the line between celebration and license was a subject of ongoing clerical concern. into this charged symbolic environment, the 1518 dancing arrived as an inversion, not pleasure but suffering, not celebration but compulsion, not the body expressing joy, but the body expressing something that had no name in the available vocabulary. The dancers were not enjoying themselves. They were not celebrating. They were not, in the judgment of any observer, choosing to dance. And yet what they were doing looked like dancing. The same movement, the same physicality, the same occupation of public space that dancing normally occupies. The unsettling quality of the dancing plague is partly this inversion, the form of a celebration in the register of a catastrophe. The external appearance of festivity enclosing something that Saverne is a small town approximately 30 kilometers northwest of Strasbourg, in the Vosges foothills at the passage where the road from Alsace crosses into Lorraine. It had a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, one of many such shrines in the region. That was a destination for pilgrims seeking relief from movement disorders, epilepsy, and related conditions. The distance from Strasbourg to Saverne was a day's journey on foot, or less by horse, through the Alsatian countryside in summer. Frau Troffea was taken there in the first week of the outbreak, and subsequent dances were directed there by the city council as part of the management of the event. The pilgrimage to Saverne had a practical logic independent of its spiritual one. It removed the afflicted individual from the city, which was the environment in which the contagion was spreading, and placed them in a rural setting, in the care of clergy at the shrine, where the symbolic framework of the saint's cure could do its work. Modern researchers who interpret the dancing plague as mass psychogenic illness regard the pilgrimage to Saverne as probably the most effective intervention the city council made. Not because the shrine cured anything, but because removal from the triggering environment is consistently the most effective intervention in mass psychogenic illness episodes. The saint's power was, in this reading, Strasbourg today is a major European city, the seat of the European Parliament and the Council of Europe, a university city, a commercial centre of the Alsace region, the medieval quarter, the Grande Isle, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the Cathedral of Notre Dame still stands, though it is no longer the world's tallest structure. The streets where the dancers of 1518 moved their bleeding feet are now tourist routes, photographed by visitors who know nothing of July 1518. The administrative records of the city from that summer are preserved in the archives and have been studied by historians of medicine, of mass psychogenic illness, of late medieval social history. The event is cited in psychology textbooks, in medical history, in studies of collective behavior and social contagion. It has entered the broader culture as a reference point for the strangeness of what large numbers of people can experience simultaneously without individual choice or obvious cause. The dancing stopped in September 1518 and has not returned. Whatever it was, it, mass psychogenic illness, something else, some combination of all of these. It belonged to a specific moment in the history of a specific city, and that moment is 500 years behind us. The city has changed. The conditions have changed. The dance, the words available to the people of 1518 for describing what was happening to the dancers of Strasbourg were not the words we would use. They did not have mass psychogenic illness, or ergotism, or collective stress response. They had the language of the body, hot blood, overheated spirits, excess humours, and they had the language of the spirit, divine punishment, demonic affliction, the curse of a saint displeased by some offence. These two vocabularies were not mutually exclusive in the 16th century. A condition could be both a natural disease and a punishment from God, since God was understood to work through natural causes as well as miraculous ones. The physicians spoke the language of the body. The clergy spoke the language of the spirit. The city council pragmatically used both, consulting physicians and sending dancers to shrines. The dancers themselves left almost no record of their own language for what they were experiencing. They appear in the sources primarily as objects of description, not as subjects of testimony. What the dancing felt like from inside is not recorded. Whether the dancers experienced what we would call dissociation, whether they felt pain or relief, whether they had any sense of what was compelling them, these things are not in the documents. The inside of the dancing plague of 1518 is the dancing plague of 1518 occurred in the same year as Martin Luther's challenge to the papacy, 1 year after his 95 Theses and in the same year as his debate with Johann Eck at Leipzig, which would eventually produce the formal break with Rome. Strasbourg would become one of the major centres of the Reformation in the following decades, and the religious landscape of the city would be transformed by the movement that Luther initiated. The relationship between the dancing plague and the Reformation is not direct. There is no evidence that Luther's challenge to the church caused or contributed to the 1518 event, but the coincidence is worth noting as context. The summer of 1518 was a moment of maximum religious anxiety in German-speaking Europe, a moment when the established framework for understanding the cosmos was beginning to show the cracks that would eventually break it open. The people who danced in the streets of Strasbourg in that summer were inhabitants of a world that was about to change in ways none of them could have predicted. The certainties of the Catholic cosmos, the saints, the shrines, the prescribed responses to divine affliction, were months away from being challenged by a theology that would redefine the relationship between the believer and God. Whether the anxieties of that transitional moment contributed to what happened on the Kornmarkt is a question that cannot be answered. Mass psychogenic illness has been documented in the modern era, in settings as different as a school in Tanzania in 1962, a factory in Belgium in 1999, and multiple high schools in the United States in the first decades of the 21st century. The symptoms vary by case. Nausea, fainting, tremors, tics, crying, or in the famous Leroy High School case of 2011 in New York, involuntary movements and vocalizations. But the pattern is consistent. A cluster of people in a defined community, under identifiable stress, experiencing symptoms that spread through social observation and contact rather than through biological vectors. The modern understanding of mass psychogenic illness does not diminish its seriousness or its significance. The suffering is real. The symptoms are genuine. The mechanism is psychological and social. But psychology and social dynamics are as real as biology, and the boundaries between them are not as clear as they once appeared to be. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 and the students of Leroy High School in 2011 were experiencing, in the frameworks available to their respective historical moments, something that the human body and human social organization are apparently capable of producing under specific conditions. Those conditions: stress, a triggering event, a shared symbolic framework, a social environment in which symptoms are visible, have recurred throughout history and will. The fiddlers hired by the City Council of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 are anonymous. Their names are not in the record. They were professional musicians of the kind that existed in every major city of the period, hired for weddings, civic celebrations, religious festivals, and the various occasions at which music was required. In July 1518, they were hired for an occasion that had no precedent in their professional experience. to play continuous accompaniment for a hall full of involuntary dancers, supporting an official medical program that they had probably not been briefed on in detail, in a situation that must have been profoundly disorienting for anyone trying to take it in. They played for days. They were eventually dismissed when the council reversed its policy and decided that music was making things worse. Whether they understood what was happening around them, whether they were frightened by it, whether they discussed it with each other as they played, none of this is recorded. They exist in the historical record only as a decision. The council decided to hire musicians. The musicians played. The decision was reversed. The musicians are not mentioned again. Their music, which filled the guild hall on the Kornmarkt through the July heat, has been silent for the bodies of the dancers of Strasbourg in 1518 were the bodies of the urban poor of the early 16th century. Bodies shaped by physical labor, by inadequate nutrition, by the accumulated effects of the diseases that were endemic in the medieval city, by the specific deprivations of the famine years that had preceded the summer of the outbreak. They were not, in general, bodies in good condition. They were bodies that had been asked to sustain a great deal before the dancing began. When the dancing started, these bodies were asked to sustain something more, continuous involuntary movement, for hours and days, without adequate rest. In summer heat, the feet bled because the shoes of the poor were not made for this kind of extended use. Thin-soled, quickly worn through on cobblestones. The joints ached. The cardiovascular system operated at levels it was not designed to maintain indefinitely. The bodies that died in the dancing plague of 1518 were bodies that had already been weakened by the conditions of their lives before the summer of July. The dancing killed them in the way that a final weight kills a structure already under load, not because the weight alone was sufficient, but because it was added to everything. History keeps the dancing plague of 1518 because the administrative apparatus of a prosperous medieval city produced documentation. It keeps it because Sebastian Brandt was a literate man who wrote things down. It keeps it because the city council had a practice of keeping minutes. It keeps it because the physicians of Strasbourg wrote up their cases for the medical literature. All of these things had to be true simultaneously for the event to remain in the record. Thousands of events in the history of medieval Europe occurred without leaving any trace in the documents, because the documents were never produced, or were produced and did not survive, or survived but have not been found. The dancing plague of 1518 is known because it was unusual enough to require an official response, and that official response generated documentation. If it had occurred in a smaller or less administratively developed city, or if the archives of Strasbourg had been damaged or destroyed by the wars that have repeatedly fought over Alsace, by fire, by neglect, it would not be known. The preservation of historical events is partly about the significance of the events and partly about the accidents of documentation and survival. The 1518 dancing is in the record partly because of what it was. The spire of Notre Dame de Strasbourg was, from its completion in 1439 until 1747, the tallest structure in the world. For over 3 centuries, it was the highest point that human beings had built, a needle of pink Vosges sandstone pointing into the sky above the Rhine Valley, visible from miles away, a reference point for travellers approaching the city from any direction. From the spire, on a clear day, you could see across the flat Alsatian plain to the Vosges in the west and the Black Forest in the east. You could see the Rhine, the silver line of Europe's great river. You could see, in July of 1518, the streets of the city below, the squares, the guild halls, the Kornmarkt, whether anyone was standing in the cathedral tower in July 1518 and watching the dancing in the streets below is not recorded. But the spire was there, as it always was, above the city, above the summer, above whatever was happening in the streets. The cathedral is still there. The spire is still there. The city below it has changed beyond recognition from what it was in 1518. The stone of the spire has been cleaned and repaired many times, but the stone is the stone that was cut from the Vosges quarries in the 14th century, and it stood over the dancing plague. The dancing plagues of medieval Europe, the cluster of episodes from the 12th to the 16th centuries, stopped. After the early 17th century, there are no comparable documented mass dancing episodes in European history. The silence is as puzzling, in its way, as the events themselves. If mass psychogenic illness is a general human capacity, triggered by stress and shared symbolic frameworks, why did it take this particular form in this particular period and then stop? Researchers have proposed several explanations. The Reformation changed the religious landscape of Europe in ways that disrupted the specific symbolic framework. The cult of Saint Vitus, the specific fears of divine punishment, the particular relationship between dancing and spiritual danger that gave the medieval dancing plagues their character. The improvement in agricultural conditions in the 17th century reduced the chronic stress of famine that appears to have been a precondition. The development of a more effective medical response to mass illness, one that prioritized removal from the triggering environment rather than the amplification of symptoms, may have shortened or prevented later episodes. Whatever the cause of the silence, it is itself data. The dancing plague was a phenomenon of a specific historical moment, and when that moment passed, there is something in the accounts of the dancing plague of 1518 that is easy to overlook in the attention paid to the medical and historical questions, the pleasure that the rest of Strasbourg took in not dancing. Every account of the outbreak is written from the perspective of an observer, not a participant. The physicians wrote from outside. The council administrators wrote from outside. Sebastian Brandt wrote from outside. Even the most sympathetic accounts carry the implicit perspective of a person who is not dancing, who is watching others dance and trying to understand what they are seeing. The experience of watching someone suffer in a form that looks like celebration, the form of dancing, the physical movement of festivity, producing not joy but agony, is a specific and disorienting one. The observers of the 1518 dancing were confronted with a phenomenon that looked like something they recognized and meant something entirely different, that used the body's capacity for exuberant expression as the medium for what was clearly, unmistakably, suffering. This invasion, the suffering wearing the face of joy, is part of what made the dancing plague frightening to those who watched it, and part of what makes it continue to fascinate those who study it after 5 centuries of documentation, study, and analysis. The dancing plague of 1518 remains incompletely explained. The mass psychogenic illness theory is the most convincing current explanation, but it is not a complete explanation. It accounts for the mechanism of transmission and the social conditions that favored the outbreak, but it does not fully account for the specific form, specifically dance-like movement rather than other forms of compulsive motion, that the symptoms took. The ergot theory accounts for the physiological trigger, but not the organized, sustained character of the movement. The religious theory, which most modern researchers set aside, actually explains the specific form more directly than the others. If you believe you are afflicted with a saint's curse that compels you to dance, you dance. The explanation that fits the specific character of the 1518 symptoms most precisely is the one that most modern researchers are least willing to accept, because it requires taking seriously the subjective experience of the dancers in terms they would have recognized: cursed, afflicted, unable to stop, rather than translating those terms into a modern diagnostic category. This is not to argue for the literal truth of the curse. It is to note that the gap between the available explanations and the complete truth of what happened on the Kornmarkt in July 1518 is still there. Alsace is a region with a history that is difficult to summarize without understatement. It has been French, German, and French again, fought over in wars that transformed Europe, absorbed into empires and republics and occupied by armies. Strasbourg itself was German from 1681 to 1918, French again after the First World War, German again under Nazi occupation from 1940 to 1944, and French again since the liberation. The city that Sebastian Brandt wrote about and the physicians managed and the city council administered in 1518 has been rebuilt, bombed, repaired, and rebuilt again, in a process that has preserved the medieval core, the Grande Isle, while transforming everything around it. The people who danced in the streets in 1518 were inhabitants of the Holy Roman Empire, subjects of a political order that no longer exists, speakers of a dialect of German that has evolved almost beyond recognition. Their land is the same land. The river is the same river. The cathedral is substantially the same cathedral. Everything else, the people, the politics, the economics, the religion, the medicine, the social order, is entirely different. The dancing plague belongs to that earlier world. The scholars who have studied the dancing plague of 1518 most seriously include the historian John Waller, whose book A Time to Dance, A Time to Die is the most comprehensive modern treatment of the case, and a number of medical historians and researchers in mass psychogenic illness who have used the 1518 event as a case study. Waller's analysis is thorough and sympathetic, taking the historical record seriously without either dismissing the phenomenon as simple superstition or accepting the supernatural explanations at face value. His argument for mass psychogenic illness as the mechanism is carefully constructed and well evidenced. He is also honest about its limitations, about what the theory explains and what it does not. The dancing plague has attracted attention from researchers in multiple disciplines because it sits at the intersection of several important questions: the relationship between psychology and physiology, the role of culture in shaping the expression of distress, the history of medicine and its relationship to human suffering, the mechanisms by which large numbers of people can simultaneously experience something that has no biological vector. It is a case study for multiple disciplines simultaneously, and the fact that it occurred 500 years ago and is documented only in fragmentary sources does not diminish its value. The dancing plague of 1518 has a particular shape as an unknown. It is an event whose facts are established, whose documentation is preserved, whose cultural context is understood, and whose explanation remains incomplete. This is a different kind of unknown from the Valentic disappearance, where the facts themselves are uncertain, or the Flannan Isles, where the physical evidence is silent. In 1518, we know what happened. We can place it in time and space and social context. We can reconstruct the sequence of events, the decisions of the council, the advice of the physicians. What we cannot do is give a complete account of why it happened, why it took the form it took, why it ended when it did, and what the dancers were experiencing from inside. The inside of the phenomenon, the subjective experience of compulsive dancing, the felt quality of whatever it was that moved those bodies through the streets of a medieval city for 2 months of summer, is not accessible to us. It was experienced by the people who went through it, and they did not leave accounts. The outside is documented. The inside is dark. Whatever the dancers of 1518 knew that we do not is not recoverable. It died with them in the late summer or the years that followed, and it left July in Strasbourg, the month in which this happened. July, with its particular light, the long days, the heat that accumulates in the stone of the buildings and releases slowly through the night, the afternoons when the sky over the Rhine Valley is a particular pale blue that is specific to this part of the world. The cathedral catches the morning sun and glows pink, the sandstone warm in the first light. The squares fill with the ordinary movement of a city's life. The market vendors set up. The river boats move on the Yell. The streets have the sound and smell of a European city in summer, which is different from any other season and any other latitude. In July of 1518, these same streets, under this same summer light, has something that does not have a complete explanation. A woman danced. Others joined her. The city tried to manage what it could not understand, and failed, and managed again, and eventually the dancing stopped. July 1518 happened. It is in the record. The record is specific and fragmentary, and it ends in September. And after September, the archive is silent about the dancing. And the city went on, and the summer ended, and Frau Troffea, wherever she was, did not dance again. Or if she did, the streets of the Grande in Strasbourg are cobbled and narrow, lined with the half-timbered buildings of the medieval and early modern city, occupied by restaurants and shops and the ordinary traffic of a 21st century European tourist destination. The cathedral is visible from most of them, its spire marking the sky. In the summer, the streets are full of people who have come from everywhere to walk in a city that has preserved its medieval form better than most. They do not know, most of them, what the summer of 1518 held. They walk on stones that are the same stones, or the successors of the same stones, that the dancers of 1518 moved on. The Kornmarkt is a square. The guild hall is gone. The archive that preserves the city council minutes from July 1518 is in a building whose existence the councillors of 1518 could not have imagined. The dancers are gone. The physicians are gone. The fiddlers are gone. The saints' shrines still exist, though their function has changed. The cathedral still stands. The summer light still falls in the same way on the same pale stone, and in the evenings the swallows still move over the old city in the same patterns they have always moved in, high and fast, against a sky that was the same sky in 1518, and will be the same sky long after we are gone. And the dancing, whatever it was,